stories for bedtime
and car time and playtime.
And anytime you want to hear how much Jesus loves you in all this world.
Even little birds.
Hi, I'm Pastor Sarah at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport, Iowa. Welcome to this podcast where we tell stories told just for kids and kids at heart. Every week we tell a story about Jesus from the Bible. And for this podcast, you need to bring your imagination. We are going to imagine that there was a little bird in all those Bible stories. A little bird who was friends with Jesus. A little bird who saw all the stuff Jesus did and heard all the things that Jesus said. Podcast friends, welcome back. I hope you had a good summer with lots of time outside to play and explore. Did you see any special birds over the summer? Maybe you saw some sparrows. Well, our friend Little Bird has missed you, and so have I. And I've missed telling these stories. I am so glad that we are back together again. This season, our second season, we are going to keep telling stories about Jesus. But while our stories from last season started at the beginning with the stories about Mary and Joseph and Jesus being born, and ended with Jesus and his death and resurrection, this season we're just going to tell stories about Jesus and his teachings, about his friends, the miracles he did. It is going to be so fun. Today, we are going to hear about one of the very first miracles that Jesus performed, and it's about a party. Everybody loves a party, especially Little Bird and Jesus.
Little Bird and Jesus at a wedding banquet.
One autumn afternoon, Little Bird was sitting in her favorite old tree in the courtyard at Mary's house. She and Jesus, along with all their friends, had come back home to Galilee. It was just the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and while he'd been to some places teaching about God and God's big dream of love for this world, Jesus had stuck close to home in the villages near Galilee. Little Bird loved her adventures with Jesus, but it was also nice to be back to her familiar branch in that courtyard where she first met Mary and where she and Jesus had played when he was a child. It was full of so many memories. As Little Bird sat on her branch, feeling the wind rustle in her feathers, she was struck by a very clear memory. A memory of when Jesus was just about 5 years old. On that day, so many years ago, it had just rained, and there were puddles in the courtyard. It didn't rain a lot where Jesus lived, so whenever it did, kids and birds would rush outside to play in the rain, so they could enjoy it as much as possible. Little Bird was in the puddle, splashing and playing. Jesus was playing in the mud. He took some clay from the mud, and while looking very carefully at Little Bird, he began to form the clay into little mud birds, a whole row of little sparrows, just like Little Bird. And then Jesus looked at Little Bird and said, "Zipporah, Zippa, I made you some playmates." Jesus showed her the little clay birds. And then he took a deep breath in. He blew on them. And the little clay birds flew up into the air. He had made those clay birds come to life. Oh, that was the best day. And it was when Little Bird really knew that something was special about Jesus. No other kid could do something like that. And so, years later, when Jesus was all grown up, Little Bird was deep in thought, remembering those little clay birds when she heard music and singing. She was so lost in her memories that she completely forgot why they had returned home. A couple in the village, friends of Jesus, they were getting married, and they were having a great big procession, like a parade, from the bride's house to the groom's house, where the party would be. Everyone was singing and making joyful music all the way down the road. Little Bird flew from the branch of her tree out to the street. It was packed with people. In Jesus' time, weddings were big celebrations, and it wasn't just the bride and groom's closest friends who got invited. The whole town was invited to be a part of the fun. As Little Bird flew overhead, she saw Jesus was there, walking behind the bride and the groom along with his friends. His arms were slung around Peter's shoulders, and they were singing and laughing. She saw Mary and Joseph among the crowds of people, too. Little Bird made a few loops above them. She loved seeing her people so happy. She wasn't a big fan of all the noise, so she flew back to the quiet of her branch. She'd fly over toward the party later and see how things were going. Weddings in Jesus' day lasted a long time, a few days, maybe even a week. It was autumn. The fields were harvested and the evenings were cool. What better thing to do than to celebrate love with all your neighbors? So, it wasn't until the next day that Little Bird decided to fly back over to the wedding party. She was starting to miss Jesus and Mary and the other friends. Not many people had big houses then, and they didn't have a big banquet hall to rent, so the parties were just held outside in the courtyard. Even the groom's family, who had enough money for servants and the best food and drink, they even held their party outside. It was nice and cool with plenty of space to dance and sing, eat and drink. As Little Bird flew over to the party, she could already tell it was a good one. She could hear people laughing and telling stories. Others were dancing and enjoying the music. People were eating and drinking to their heart's content. Peter and Andrew, some of Jesus' friends, noticed Little Bird when she landed on a branch near them. "Little Bird," they said, "this party is amazing! The best party ever!" And then, from her perch, she noticed a bunch of servants huddled up with the steward, the person in charge of the party. They all had worried looks on their faces. She quietly flew over to them and listened in. "There's none left," said one of the servants. "Not a single drop." The steward replied, "How can that be? Look at all these wine jars." The servants picked them up one at a time and tipped them over. Not one single drop fell from them. Those wine jars were all empty. The steward put his head in his hands. "What are we going to do? This will bring such shame and sadness upon my family. We can't run out of wine." Now, these were days before you could just run to the store if you ran out of something. Most people had made their own wine, and they made everything else too. So this was really a big problem. Little Bird thought about Jesus. Jesus could probably help things out. After all, he made clay birds fly and sick people well. Why couldn't he make some wine appear for his friend's party? Little Bird flew around the crowded party, but she couldn't find Jesus. But she did see Mary, and she flew over to her and tried to tell her what was going on. But remember, Jesus was the only one who knew how to speak sparrow. No one else could understand her. Little Bird tried to play her game of bird charades, acting out an empty jar. But Mary thought Little Bird was trying to tell her she needed to get a jar of water and take a bath. Finally, she gave up, and she signaled for Mary to follow her. Mary did, and when Mary saw what was happening, And even though the wine steward was embarrassed to admit it, he shared that they were out of wine. Quickly, Mary went looking for Jesus and found him, talking with his friends about how parties like this one really show what God wants for us. Everyone is invited. There's enough food and wine for everyone. So much joy and delight. But as Jesus was talking, Mary interrupted and pulled Jesus aside. "Jesus," Mary said, "they've run out of wine. Can't you do something?" But Jesus said, "Mom, what could I do? This isn't our problem to fix." But Mary went to the steward and said to him, "Whatever my son Jesus asks, you do it. He'll make things right." Nearby to them were these 6 big stone jars, each big enough to hold 20 or 30 gallons of water. Now, kids, that's 30 big plastic milk jugs full. They were huge. Jesus said, "Please fill up those containers with as much water as you can." So the servants went out to the well and filled each one all the way to the top until they were nearly overflowing. They were so heavy, they had to work as a team to get them back to the party. But by the time they did, the servants were wet from the water that sloshed out of them and from their own sweat. They set the jars on the floor and stood there looking at Jesus, wondering what in the world he was up to. But Jesus told them to fill the pitchers and serve it to the guests. The servants looked at him, wondering what he was doing. But they did it anyway. They filled their pitchers with the liquid from inside the jars. But as they did so, they noticed something very unexpected. The liquid inside wasn't clear, fresh water. It was dark red. It was wine. Little Bird watched as they carried the wine to the person in charge at the party, grinning ear to ear with the secret of how the wine had just moments before been water. When the man tasted it, his eyes went wide. He smiled and said, "This wine is the best I've ever had. It's delicious." He poured another cup and took it to the bride and the groom. "Taste this wine," he said. "It's amazing. Everyone else serves the best wine first, but you have saved the best for last." Soon everyone was drinking this amazing new wine, though no one but Jesus and Mary and those servants knew how that wine came to be. It was Jesus' first miracle, a beautiful one that made a celebration of love even more incredible. And Little Bird knew about it too. And she thought about what Jesus had said, about how wedding parties are like God's big dream for the world, where there's always enough and everyone is invited and the love is overflowing and never runs out, even when it might seem that it would. Such a fun story! Have you ever been to a wedding or another fancy party? What was it like? Did you get to dance? What do you think would have happened if the host ran out of food or water or cake? Maybe you can draw a picture of how you imagine this party to look like. Make sure you include those jugs of water turned into wine. This story is about Jesus' first miracle. Sometimes it seems like a funny thing for Jesus to do, not nearly as important as helping a blind person to see or making a sick person well. But I think this story reminds us that our lives are meant to live in joy with other people, sharing all that we have so that everyone has enough. Maybe this week, you can try to make something ordinary a little extraordinary, like Jesus did. Ask your parents to get out fancy glasses for dinner, or have a dance party while you do the dishes. Or maybe you can just throw a party. for no other reason than because we have a God who loves us so very much, with love that will never run out. Thank you for listening to this episode of Little Bird and Jesus.
Now flap your little wings. Sing a little song.
And remember that to Jesus,
You will always belong.
Thanks for listening to Little Bird and Jesus, a podcast of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport, Iowa. For more information on St. Paul, visit us at stpaulqc.org.